The morning sun cast long shadows across the small Afghan village as Dr. Sarah Martinez adjusted her worn medical bag and stepped out of the dusty jeep. The heat was already becoming unbearable, and sweat beaded on her forehead beneath the simple headscarf she wore to blend in with the local customs. To everyone around her, she appeared to be just another civilian doctor working with the humanitarian aid organization that had been providing medical care to the remote villages scattered throughout the region. Sarah had been living this double life for 3 years now. On the surface, she was Dr. Martinez, a dedicated physician who had left her comfortable practice in California to help those in need. The villagers knew her as the kind American woman who treated their children's infections, delivered their babies, and never asked for payment beyond a warm meal or a place to sleep. They trusted her completely, inviting her into their homes and sharing their deepest concerns about the ongoing conflict that had torn their country apart for decades. What they didn't know was that Sarah Martinez was actually Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez, a Navy SEAL medic with over 15 years of military service. Her real mission wasn't just to provide medical care, though that was certainly part of it. She was gathering intelligence, building relationships, and serving as the eyes and ears for special operations teams that operated in the shadows of this war-torn region. The transformation from elite warrior to village doctor hadn't been easy. During her SEAL training, Sarah had learned to push her body beyond its limits, to remain calm under fire, and to make life or death decisions in split seconds. But this mission required different skills entirely. She had to learn to be patient, gentle, and approachable. She had to master the art of appearing vulnerable while remaining constantly alert for threats. As she walked through the narrow dirt streets toward the small clinic she had established in an abandoned schoolhouse, children ran up to greet her with bright smiles and excited chatter in Dari. She had picked up enough of the language to communicate basic medical needs, though she often relied on Farid, a young man from the village who served as her translator and had become something of a friend over the months. The clinic was already bustling with activity when she arrived. Word had spread that she would be there today, and people had traveled from neighboring villages to seek her help. An elderly man with a persistent cough waited patiently on a wooden bench, while a young mother held a feverish baby close to her chest. Sarah smiled warmly at each of them, her demeanor giving no hint of the tactical awareness that constantly ran through her mind, cataloging exits, potential threats, and defensive positions. Farid greeted her at the door with his usual enthusiasm. He was 23 years old, full of dreams about becoming a real doctor someday, and had been invaluable in helping her understand not just the language, but the cultural nuances that could make or break her mission. Through him, she had learned which village elders held real influence, which families had connections to various factions in the conflict, and where the safest places to travel were on any given day. As the morning progressed, Sarah treated a steady stream of patients. She cleaned and bandaged wounds, prescribed antibiotics for infections, and provided vitamins for malnourished children. Each interaction was genuine. Her medical training was real, and her desire to help these people was sincere. But she was also listening carefully to conversations, noting who mentioned seeing unusual activity in the mountains, who seemed nervous about discussing recent events, and which families had suddenly acquired new possessions that might indicate connections to smuggling operations. Around midday, as she was examining a young boy's broken arm, she heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors. The noise was faint at first, but gradually grew louder. The villagers in the clinic began to shift nervously, their conversations dropping to worried whispers. Helicopter visits were never routine in this area, and they usually meant trouble was coming. Sarah continued her examination, keeping her expression calm and focused on her patient. But every nerve in her body was now on high alert. Through her peripheral vision, she could see people beginning to gather outside, pointing toward the sky and speaking in urgent tones. Farid appeared at her side, his face tense with concern. The sound of the helicopters was getting closer, and Sarah could now distinguish the distinctive rhythm of military aircraft. Based on the sound pattern, she estimated at least 2 helicopters, possibly 3, and they were heading directly toward the village. This wasn't a routine patrol or a simple flyover. Something significant was happening, and she needed to be ready for anything. She finished splinting the boy's arm and sent him to his mother with gentle instructions about keeping the splint dry and clean. As she gathered her supplies, she ran through various scenarios in her mind. Had her cover been blown? Was this a routine sweep that had nothing to do with her? Or was something bigger happening in the region that she hadn't been informed about? The helicopters were almost overhead now, their rotor wash beginning to stir up clouds of dust that drifted through the open windows of the clinic. Sarah could see the fear in her patient's eyes, and she knew that whatever was about to happen, her carefully constructed identity as a simple civilian doctor was about to be put to the ultimate test. Outside, she could hear shouting and the sound of vehicles approaching. The helicopters had landed somewhere close by, and now ground forces were moving into the village. Sarah's military training screamed at her to assess the situation, identify threats, and prepare for action. But Dr. Martinez, the civilian doctor, was supposed to be confused and frightened like everyone else around her. Fareed grabbed her arm, his eyes wide with panic. The moment of truth was approaching, and Sarah knew that the next few minutes would determine whether her mission continued or whether 3 years of careful work would come to a sudden and possibly violent end. The sound of boots hitting the ground outside the clinic grew louder and more organized. Sarah could distinguish the disciplined movement of trained soldiers from the panicked shuffling of villagers. Through the dusty windows, she caught glimpses of camouflage uniforms and tactical gear. These weren't local forces. The equipment and movement patterns suggested American or coalition troops. Fareed's grip on her arm tightened as his panic increased. "Doctor, what do we do? Should we hide? Should we run?" His voice was barely a whisper, but the terror in it was unmistakable. Around them, the remaining patients in the clinic were gathering their belongings and heading for the back exit, clearly wanting to distance themselves from whatever military operation was unfolding. Sarah forced herself to remain in character, even as every instinct screamed at her to take control of the situation. "Stay calm," she whispered back to Fareed, her voice carrying just the right amount of fear that a civilian doctor might feel. "We're medical personnel. We haven't done anything wrong." But even as she spoke these reassuring words, her mind was racing through possibilities. Had intelligence linked her to something? Was this a coincidence? Or worse, had there been a security breach that exposed her real identity? She thought about the encrypted communications device hidden in her medical bag, the emergency extraction protocols she had memorized, and the backup identities that were supposed to keep her safe if everything went wrong. The front door of the clinic burst open without warning. 3 soldiers in full combat gear swept into the room, their weapons raised and ready. Behind them came a 4th figure, a man in his 40s wearing the insignia of a Special Forces captain. His eyes scanned the room quickly and professionally, taking in every detail before settling on Sarah. "Everyone remain calm," he announced in accented Dari, though his gaze never left Sarah's face. "We're conducting a routine security sweep. No one will be harmed if you cooperate." He switched to English as he approached her. "Are you Dr. Martinez?" Sarah's heart pounded, but she kept her expression confused and slightly frightened, exactly as a civilian would be in this situation. "Yes, I'm Dr. Martinez. I run the medical clinic here. Is there some kind of problem?" Her voice carried just the right tremor of nervousness, and she instinctively stepped slightly behind Fareed as if seeking protection. The captain studied her for a long moment. Sarah could see him taking in her appearance, the simple clothes, the medical bag, the way she held herself. To him, she probably looked exactly like what she was supposed to be, a dedicated but naive humanitarian worker who had gotten in over her head in a dangerous part of the world. "We've received reports of unusual activity in this area," the captain said carefully. "We need to ask you some questions about what you might have seen or heard recently." He gestured for his men to lower their weapons slightly, but they remained alert and ready for trouble. Fareed stepped forward protectively, his fear transforming into the kind of courage that often surprised people in crisis situations. "Sir, Dr. Martinez is a good woman. She helps our people. She has done nothing wrong." His English was broken but passionate, and Sarah felt a genuine pang of guilt about the deception she was perpetrating on this young man who had become a friend. The captain nodded, respectfully to Fareed, but kept his attention focused on Sarah. "I'm sure that's true, but we still need to ask some questions. Dr. Martinez, how long have you been working in this village?" Sarah launched into the carefully crafted backstory she had been living for 3 years. She told him about her decision to leave her practice in California, about the humanitarian organization that had sponsored her work, about the challenges of providing medical care in such a remote and dangerous area. Every detail was true, even if the larger picture was a carefully constructed lie. As she spoke, she watched the captain's reactions carefully. He was clearly experienced and intelligent, asking follow-up questions that would have tripped up someone with a false identity. But Sarah's cover story wasn't false, it was just incomplete. She really was a trained physician. She really had left a comfortable life to work in Afghanistan. She just hadn't mentioned her military background or her real reasons for being there. During the questioning, more soldiers had entered the clinic and were conducting what appeared to be a thorough but respectful search. They checked her medical supplies, examined her equipment, and looked through the simple living quarters she had set up in the back of the building. Sarah knew they wouldn't find anything suspicious. Her real mission. Equipment was hidden in locations throughout the village that would be nearly impossible to discover without specific intelligence. One of the soldiers approached the captain and whispered something in his ear. The captain's expression shifted slightly, becoming more intense. He looked at Sarah again, this time with what seemed like growing suspicion. "Dr. Martinez, we understand you've been traveling to several villages in this region. Can you tell us about your movements over the past few weeks?" This was dangerous territory. Sarah's travels had indeed taken her to villages where she knew intelligence operations were ongoing. She had to be careful to account for her movements without revealing information that only someone with military clearance would know. She began describing her medical visits, making sure to emphasize the humanitarian nature of her work while staying as close to the truth as possible. As she spoke, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. One of the soldiers searching her equipment had found her medical bag and was examining it more closely than the others. He was running his hands along the seams, checking for hidden compartments with the systematic thoroughness of someone trained to find concealed items. If he discovered the encrypted communication device hidden in the specially modified compartment, her cover would be blown completely. The soldier's fingers paused at exactly the spot where the device was hidden. Sarah's military training took over, flooding her system with adrenaline while keeping her expression perfectly neutral. She continued answering the captain's questions while simultaneously calculating distances, exit routes, and the likelihood that she could disable the nearest soldier and reach the hidden pistol she kept in the clinic's supply closet. But she remained motionless, playing her role, knowing that any sudden movement or change in behavior could trigger a confrontation that would endanger not only her mission, but the lives of Farid and any villagers who might be caught in the crossfire. The next few seconds would determine whether 3 years of careful work would continue, or whether everything would come crashing down in a hail of gunfire and blown cover identities. The soldier's fingers pressed against the hidden compartment, and Sarah could see the exact moment when he realized something was wrong. His expression changed subtly, the kind of shift that only someone with extensive military training would notice. He looked up, catching the captain's eye, and gave an almost imperceptible nod. Sarah felt the familiar calm that had carried her through countless dangerous situations settle over her mind. Time seemed to slow down as her SEAL training kicked in, analyzing every person in the room, every possible weapon, every potential escape route. She could disable the soldier examining her bag in less than 2 seconds, reach the concealed pistol in 4, and have control of the situation in under 10. But doing so would mean abandoning 3 years of deep cover work and potentially endangering Farid and the other villagers. The captain's demeanor shifted as he received the silent signal from his soldier. His questions became sharper, more probing. "Dr. Martinez, you mentioned that you communicate with your organization regularly. What kind of communication equipment do you use?" This was it. Sarah knew they had found something, and now they were giving her a chance to explain it before they revealed their discovery. She had to make a decision that would determine not just her fate, but potentially the success or failure of ongoing operations throughout the region. "I have a satellite phone for emergencies," she said carefully, sticking to the story that would explain the most obvious pieces of communication equipment. "The regular cell towers don't work reliably out here, and sometimes I need to coordinate medical evacuations or supply deliveries." The captain nodded, but his eyes had grown cold and calculating. "Show us this satellite phone." Sarah moved slowly toward her bag, very aware that every eye in the room was now focused on her movements. The soldier who had been examining her equipment stepped back slightly, his hand moving closer to his sidearm. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. She reached into the main compartment of her medical bag and withdrew a standard commercial satellite phone, exactly the kind that humanitarian workers actually used in remote areas. It was real, functional, and completely legitimate, but she knew it wasn't what they had found. The captain examined the phone briefly, then looked back at her with an expression that suggested he wasn't buying her story. "This is interesting, Dr. Martinez, but my specialist here thinks there might be other communication equipment in your bag. Would you mind if we took a more thorough look?" Before Sarah could respond, the sound of automatic gunfire erupted from somewhere outside the clinic. The sharp crack of AK-47s mixed with the deeper chatter of American M4 rifles. Shouts in multiple languages filled the air, and the sound of running feet suggested that a significant firefight was developing in the village streets. The soldiers in the clinic immediately shifted into combat mode, their attention dividing between the potential threat that Sarah represented and the very real battle that was unfolding outside. The captain spoke quickly into his radio, requesting a status update and calling for backup. Through the chaos, Sarah caught fragments of radio chatter that painted a picture of what was happening. An insurgent cell had apparently been using the village as a staging area, and the military operation she had stumbled into was designed to capture or eliminate them. The timing was either incredibly bad luck or the result of intelligence that someone had been operating in the area. Fareed grabbed her arm again, his eyes wide with terror as the sound of gunfire grew closer. "Doctor, we have to get out of here. The fighting is coming this way." His concern for her safety was genuine and touching, making her deception feel even more painful. The captain was shouting orders to his men, trying to coordinate their response to the unexpected firefight while keeping an eye on Sarah. Two of his soldiers moved toward the windows to assess the tactical situation outside, while the third maintained his position near Sarah, but was clearly distracted by the sound of combat. This was the opportunity Sarah had been unconsciously waiting for. In the confusion and chaos, she could potentially escape, disappear into the maze of village streets, and make her way to one of her prepared safe houses. Her extraction protocols included contingencies for exactly this kind of situation. But as she looked at Fareed's frightened face, she realized she couldn't abandon him. Over the past 3 years, she had grown genuinely fond of the young man who had become her friend and translator. He had helped her understand the village, protected her from cultural misunderstandings, and trusted her completely. Running away now would almost certainly mean leaving him to face questioning about her disappearance, and possibly worse if the soldiers concluded he had been helping her conceal her real identity. The gunfire outside was getting closer, and Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of bullets hitting the walls of nearby buildings. Whatever insurgent cell the soldiers had come to find was putting up serious resistance, and the clinic was likely to become part of the battlefield very soon. The captain finished his radio conversation and turned back to Sarah with grim determination. "Dr. Martinez, I'm afraid we're going to have to continue this conversation somewhere safer. My orders are to evacuate all civilian personnel from the area until this situation is resolved." Sarah nodded, playing the role of a confused and frightened humanitarian worker. "Of course, Captain. Whatever you think is best. But what about my patients? There are people in the village who depend on this clinic. They'll have to wait," he said curtly. "Right now, keeping you alive is my priority." There was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't just talking about her safety as a civilian. The way he said keeping you alive had the weight of someone who suspected her real value was much greater than it appeared. As they prepared to move, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to play the helpless civilian, instead of running away to preserve her cover, she was going to do something that would expose her real identity, but might save lives. The sound of wounded men calling for help outside the clinic had triggered something deeper than her mission parameters. She was, at her core, a medic. And medics didn't abandon wounded people, regardless of the consequences. The sound of someone screaming for a medic pierced through the gunfire outside, and Sarah felt every muscle in her body tense with the need to respond. Years of military training had conditioned her to react instantly to that particular call, regardless of the circumstances or personal risk. The voice was American, young and filled with the kind of desperation that meant someone was bleeding out fast. "Wait," she said to the captain, her voice carrying a tone of authority that hadn't been there moments before. "There's someone hurt out there. I can help. The captain looked at her with surprise. The frightened humanitarian worker from minutes earlier had been replaced by someone who sounded confident and decisive. Dr. Martinez, it's too dangerous. We need to get you out of here. Another scream for a medic, closer this time, followed by the distinctive sound of an IED explosion that shook the walls of the clinic. Sarah could hear the aftermath. More shouting, more calls for medical help, and the organized chaos that followed a mass casualty event. Her medical training and her warrior instincts were both screaming at her to move, to help, to do what she had been trained to do, Captain. I'm a doctor, she said firmly, abandoning the helpless civilian act completely. Those are wounded men out there. I have medical supplies and training. I can help save lives. The captain studied her face, clearly recognizing that something fundamental had changed in her demeanor. The woman standing before him now moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under pressure. It's too dangerous, he repeated, but with less conviction than before. Sarah was already moving toward her medical bag, pulling out trauma supplies with the kind of systematic efficiency that spoke of extensive experience with battlefield medicine. Captain, with respect, people are dying out there. I took an oath to do no harm, but I also took an oath to help when I can. I'm going out there. Fareed watched this transformation with amazement and growing confusion. The gentle doctor he had known for 3 years was suddenly speaking with the authority of someone used to command, organizing medical supplies with military precision, and talking about walking into an active firefight as if it were routine. Doctor, what are you doing? He asked in Dari, his voice filled with bewilderment. You can't go out there. You'll be killed. Sarah looked at him, feeling the weight of her deception more heavily than ever. Fareed, I have to. It's what I'm trained for. She switched to English, addressing the captain. I need 2 of your men to help carry wounded, and I need you to radio your units to establish a casualty collection point in the courtyard behind this building. The captain's eyes widened. The woman giving him tactical medical advice was clearly not the simple humanitarian worker she had pretended to be. Her knowledge of military medical procedures, her confident use of proper terminology, and her complete lack of fear in the face of active combat revealed training that went far beyond civilian medical school. Who are you? He asked directly. Before Sarah could answer, a soldier burst through the front door of the clinic, his uniform torn and bloody. Captain, we've got multiple casualties from that IED. Sergeant Rodriguez is down bad and Private Chen is bleeding out. We need a medic now, sir. Sarah didn't wait for permission. She grabbed her medical bag and pushed past the startled soldier, heading for the door. Show me where they are, she commanded, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to emergency medical situations. The captain and his men followed her outside, where the scene was chaos. The IED had caught a squad of soldiers in the open, and the wounded were scattered across the dusty street. Sarah immediately began triaging, her movement swift and professional as she assessed each casualty. Sergeant Rodriguez had taken shrapnel to the chest and was struggling to breathe. Sarah dropped to her knees beside him, her hands moving with practiced precision as she examined the wound. Pneumothorax, she announced to no one in particular, reaching into her bag for a chest tube. I need someone to hold him steady. The captain knelt beside her, watching in amazement as she performed the procedure with the skill of a combat medic. This was not the technique of a civilian doctor who might have read about battlefield medicine. This was someone who had done this before many times under similar conditions. Where did you learn to do that? He asked as she worked. Later, Sarah replied curtly, focused entirely on saving Rodriguez's life. Right now, help me get Private Chen over here. He's got arterial bleeding that won't wait. As she worked on the wounded soldiers, using techniques and equipment that clearly indicated advanced military medical training, a crowd of villagers began to gather at a safe distance. Among them, Sarah could see Fareed watching her with an expression of complete shock and dawning understanding. The young man who had become her friend was realizing that everything he thought he knew about Dr. Martinez had been a lie. The gentle humanitarian worker who had treated his people's illnesses and delivered their babies was actually someone else entirely. Someone with the skills and knowledge to perform battlefield surgery under fire. Sarah finished stabilizing Private Chen and moved to the next casualty, working with a level of efficiency and expertise that left no doubt about her real background. She called out medical terminology, organized the evacuation of wounded, and coordinated with the unit's actual medic in a way that revealed extensive experience with military medical procedures. The captain continued to watch her work, putting together pieces of a puzzle that was becoming clearer by the minute. Her knowledge of tactical medicine, her comfort with military protocols, her complete lack of surprise at finding herself in a combat situation, all of it pointed to one conclusion. "You're military," he said finally. It wasn't a question. Sarah looked up from the soldier she was treating, blood on her hands and determination in her eyes. The moment she had been dreading for 3 years had finally arrived. Her cover was blown, her carefully constructed identity was in ruins, and there was no going back to being the simple village doctor. But as she looked at the wounded men around her, she realized she didn't regret her decision. Some things were more important than maintaining cover, and saving lives was one of them. "Yeah," she said simply, returning her attention to the wounded soldier. "I'm military." The captain nodded slowly, his suspicions confirmed. "What unit?" Sarah paused in her work for just a moment, knowing that her next words would change everything. "Navy SEALs. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez. And right now, Captain, that's all you need to know." The silence that followed Sarah's revelation was broken only by the distant sound of ongoing gunfire and the labored breathing of the wounded soldiers she was treating. The captain stared at her with a mixture of shock, respect, and confusion. Navy SEALs were legendary among military personnel, and the idea that one had been operating as a village doctor for 3 years was almost incomprehensible. "Lieutenant Commander," the captain said slowly, testing out the title. "I'm Captain Mike Stevens, Army Special Forces." "What the hell is a SEAL medic doing running a clinic in rural Afghanistan?" Sarah continued working on her patient while she answered, never breaking the rhythm of her medical procedures. "That's classified, Captain. But right now, we have bigger problems than my mission parameters." She gestured toward the ongoing firefight. "How many insurgents are we dealing with?" Stevens found himself automatically deferring to her authority, even though the situation was completely surreal. Intelligence suggested a cell of 8 to 10, but they seemed better organized and equipped than we expected. They had IEDs pre-positioned and knew exactly where to hit us. As if to emphasize his point, another explosion rocked the village, this one close enough to shower them with debris. Sarah shielded her patient instinctively, her body language revealing the kind of combat awareness that only came from extensive experience under fire. "They had advance warning," she said grimly. "Someone told them you were coming." This observation hit Stevens like a physical blow. The possibility that their operation had been compromised explained a lot about how badly things had gone wrong. But it also raised serious questions about security and intelligence leaks that went far beyond a single village firefight. Fareed had been watching this exchange from a distance, but now he approached slowly, his face a mask of confusion and hurt. When he spoke, it was in English, directed at Sarah. "Doctor, Lieutenant Commander, I don't understand. Who are you really?" Sarah looked up from her patient to meet Fareed's eyes, and for the first time since the shooting started, her professional composure cracked slightly. She saw the pain in his expression, the sense of betrayal that came from learning that someone he had trusted and cared about had been living a lie. "I'm still the same person who treated your sister's pneumonia," she said softly. "I'm still the same person who helped deliver Mrs. Azimi's baby. The medical care was real, Fareed. My concern for your people was real. Only my background was different." "But you're a soldier," he said, the word carrying weight and complexity in his culture and situation. "You're part of this war." Before Sarah could respond, Stevens interrupted with urgency in his voice. "Commander, we need to move these casualties to a more secure location. The insurgents are regrouping for another push, and this position is too exposed." Sarah nodded, immediately shifting back into tactical mode. "There's a compound 3 blocks north of here with thick walls and multiple exit routes. The family evacuated yesterday when they heard helicopters coming. We can use it as a casualty collection point." Stevens looked at her with new respect. Not only did she know the tactical value of buildings in the area, but she had been tracking civilian movements in a way that suggested extensive intelligence gathering. "How do you know all this?" "Because it's been my job to know," she replied simply. "Captain, I've been operating in this region for 3 years. I know every family, every building, every route in and out of here. Right now, that knowledge can keep your men alive." As they organized the evacuation of wounded, Sarah's true capabilities became increasingly apparent. She coordinated the movement with military precision, identified safe routes that avoided known insurgent positions, and demonstrated a level of tactical awareness that impressed even the Special Forces captain. But with each display of her real skills, the gulf between her and Farid grew wider. The young man who had been her friend and translator now watched her with the wariness of someone who realized he had never really known her at all. The movement to the secure compound was conducted under sporadic gunfire, with Sarah and Stevens working together to coordinate both the medical care of the wounded and the tactical movement of the unit. Her dual role as medical officer and intelligence asset created a unique perspective that proved invaluable in the crisis. Once they reached the compound, Sarah set up a proper casualty treatment area, while Stevens established defensive positions. The wounded soldiers she had treated were stable for now, but they needed evacuation to a proper medical facility as soon as possible. "Commander," Stevens said during a brief lull in the fighting, "I need to report this situation to my superiors. Your presence here, the intelligence implications, the fact that our operation was apparently compromised, this goes way beyond what my unit can handle." Sarah nodded, knowing that her 3 years of deep cover were now officially over. "I understand, Captain. But first we need to get your men out of here alive. The insurgents know this area as well as I do, and they're not going to give up easily." As if summoned by her words, the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds filled the air. Sarah recognized the sound immediately and reacted with the reflexes of someone who had been under mortar attack many times before. "Incoming," she shouted, throwing herself over the wounded soldiers to shield them from the blast. The mortar rounds impacted in the courtyard outside the compound, sending shrapnel and debris flying through the air. When the dust settled, Sarah could hear the sound of insurgents moving closer, calling out to each other in preparation for what sounded like a coordinated assault on their position. Stevens was talking rapidly into his radio, calling for air support and medical evacuation, but Sarah could tell from his expression that help was not coming quickly enough. They were trapped in a compound with wounded soldiers, facing an organized enemy force that knew the terrain and had them outnumbered. Farid crouched near the wall, clearly terrified but refusing to abandon the group. Despite his confusion and sense of betrayal, his loyalty to Sarah, or to whoever she really was, remained strong. "How many rounds do you have left?" Sarah asked Stevens, her mind already working through the tactical problem they faced. "Not enough," he replied grimly. "Maybe 30 minutes of sustained fire if we're careful." Sarah looked around the compound, assessing their defensive positions and considering their options. Her SEAL training had prepared her for exactly this kind of situation, but usually with a full team of equally trained operators. Here she had a handful of soldiers, several wounded men who couldn't fight, and a young civilian who was questioning everything he thought he knew about her. But she also had 3 years' worth of intelligence about insurgent tactics, local geography, and hidden resources that no one else in the compound possessed. If they were going to survive the next few hours, she would have to use every bit of that knowledge. "Captain," she said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had faced impossible odds before, "I have an idea, but you're going to have to trust me completely." Stevens looked at Sarah with the kind of intense focus that only came in life-or-death situations. Around them, the sound of insurgents moving into position grew louder and more organized. Whatever plan she had, they needed to implement it quickly. "What do you have in mind, Commander?" he asked. Sarah pointed to a section of the compound's back wall that appeared solid, but which she knew concealed a weakness. "There's a drainage tunnel behind that wall that connects to the old irrigation system. It's been dry for 2 years, but it's still passable. The tunnel comes out about half a mile from here, near the old marketplace." Stevens studied the wall she was indicating. To him it looked like solid stone, but he had learned to trust Sarah's knowledge of the area. "How do you know about this tunnel?" "Because 3 months ago I helped a family hide there when a different insurgent group was threatening them," she replied. "It's not on any maps and most people have forgotten it exists, but it's big enough for a man to crawl through, and it's our best chance of getting the wounded out of here." The plan she outlined was complex and dangerous. They would need to create a diversion to draw the insurgents away from the back of the compound, then quietly evacuate the wounded through the tunnel while a small team held the main position to maintain the illusion that everyone was still trapped inside. I'll take the wounded through the tunnel, Sarah continued. I know the route and I can get them to the marketplace where your evacuation helicopters can reach them safely. You and your men create enough noise here to keep the insurgents focused on this position. Stevens shook his head immediately. No way, Commander. I'm not letting a fellow officer take that risk alone. One of my men goes with you. Captain, with respect, your men don't know the tunnel system or the safe routes through the village. If we get lost down there, everyone dies. I go alone with the wounded. Fareed suddenly stepped forward, his voice quiet but determined. I know the tunnels too. Both Sarah and Stevens turned to look at him in surprise. The young man's face was pale, but his expression was resolute. My grandfather helped build part of that irrigation system 40 years ago. Fareed continued in careful English. He showed me the tunnels when I was a boy. I know another way out, one that comes up inside the old mosque. It's closer than the marketplace. Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions as she looked at Fareed. Despite learning that she had been deceiving him for 3 years, he was still willing to risk his life to help save wounded soldiers. His loyalty and courage were humbling, especially considering how badly she had betrayed his trust. Fareed, this is too dangerous, she said. These aren't your people and this isn't your fight. He looked at her with an expression that was both hurt and determined. You saved my sister's life. You helped my people for 3 years. Maybe you lied about who you are, but you didn't lie about caring for us. Now I help you. Stevens watched this exchange with growing respect for both of them. Commander, if he knows another route, that could be the difference between success and failure. But it's his choice to make. The sound of gunfire erupted again, closer this time, as the insurgents began probing the compound's defenses. Time was running out, and they needed to make a decision quickly. Sarah looked around at the wounded soldiers lying in the makeshift medical area she had created. Sergeant Rodriguez was conscious now, but still weak from his chest wound. Private Chen was stable, but would need surgery soon. 2 other soldiers had injuries that weren't life-threatening, but would make movement difficult. All right, she decided. Fareed and I take the wounded through the tunnels. Captain, you and your remaining men hold this position for 30 minutes, then follow us out. Make as much noise as possible to keep their attention. Stevens nodded, already mentally preparing his men for what would essentially be a fighting withdrawal. What's our communication plan? Sarah reached into her medical bag and pulled out the encrypted communication device that had nearly blown her cover earlier. I'll signal you when we're clear of the tunnels. If you don't hear from me in 45 minutes, assume we didn't make it and get your people out however you can. As they prepared for the evacuation, Sarah found herself working alongside Fareed with the same easy coordination they had developed over 3 years of medical work together. Despite the circumstances and revelations, their partnership remained effective and natural. Fareed, she said quietly as they prepared to move the first wounded soldier. When this is over, we need to talk. There are things I need to explain. He looked at her with sad eyes. I know, Doctor. But first we save these men. The opening they made in the wall revealed a narrow drainage tunnel that disappeared into darkness. Sarah tested the air and confirmed that it was breathable, then began the delicate process of moving wounded soldiers into a space barely large enough for them to crawl through. Rodriguez went first, followed by Chen and the other wounded. Sarah and Fareed worked together to help each man into the tunnel, their movements efficient despite the difficult conditions and the ongoing sound of gunfire above ground. As the last wounded soldier disappeared into the tunnel, Sarah paused for a moment to look back at Stevens and his men. These soldiers had stumbled into her carefully constructed world and blown her cover completely, but they had also reminded her of who she really was beneath the disguise. 30 minutes, Captain, she said firmly. Then get your people out of here. Stevens nodded. Good luck, Commander, and thank you. Sarah and Fareed crawled into the tunnel behind the wounded soldiers, beginning a journey that would take them through the dark underground passages beneath the village. As they moved through the cramped space, Sarah couldn't help but think about how much her life had changed in the space of a few hours. The careful balance she had maintained for 3 years was gone forever. Her mission was compromised, her cover was blown, and her relationship with Fareed and the village community would never be the same. But as she listened to the wounded soldiers ahead of her, making their way toward safety, she knew she had made the right choice. Some things were more important than maintaining cover, and saving lives was definitely one of them. Behind them, The sound of intensifying gunfire suggested that Stevens and his men were doing their part to sell the deception. Now it was up to her and Farid to get the wounded to safety, before the insurgents realized that their main targets had slipped away into the darkness below ground. The tunnel stretched ahead of them, leading toward an uncertain future where nothing would ever be the same again. The tunnel was even more cramped and difficult than Sarah had anticipated. The wounded soldiers ahead of her were making slow progress, their injuries and the confined space combining to create a nightmare of logistics and medical concern. Every few minutes she had to stop to check on their conditions, ensuring that none of them were going into shock or developing complications from their wounds. Farid proved invaluable as they navigated the underground maze. His childhood exploration of the tunnels gave him an intuitive sense of direction that complemented Sarah's tactical training. When they reached a junction where 3 passages met, he confidently pointed toward the left tunnel. "This way leads to the mosque," he whispered. "The other passages have collapsed sections." As they continued crawling through the darkness, Sarah found herself thinking about the conversation she owed Farid once they reached safety. How do you explain to someone that you've spent 3 years lying about your fundamental identity? How do you tell a friend that every interaction you've had has been filtered through a carefully constructed deception? The sound of gunfire above them had faded to a distant rumble, suggesting that they had moved a significant distance from the compound. But Sarah knew they weren't safe yet. The insurgents were experienced fighters who understood that their enemies might try to escape through unconventional routes. "Commander," Rodriguez whispered from ahead of them, his voice strained with pain and effort, "I'm having trouble breathing again." Sarah immediately crawled forward to examine him, using her hands to assess his condition in the darkness. His breathing was shallow and rapid, and she could feel that his pulse was becoming irregular. The chest tube she had inserted was still functioning, but the stress of crawling through the tunnel was taking its toll on his already weakened system. "We need to get him out of here soon," she told Farid quietly. "His body can't take much more of this." Farid nodded and increased their pace slightly, balancing speed against the need to move carefully through the treacherous tunnel. The passage began to slope upward, suggesting they were approaching their exit point near the mosque. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, they reached a section where natural light filtered down from above. Farid studied the area carefully, then pointed to a narrow shaft that led upward. "There," he said. "This comes up behind the mosque, near the old well. But we need to be very quiet. Sometimes people hide there during fighting." Sarah helped lift the wounded soldiers up through the shaft one by one, while Farid climbed ahead to ensure the area was secure. When she finally emerged from the tunnel herself, she found herself in a small courtyard surrounded by ancient stone walls. The mosque's minaret rose above them, and she could hear the distant sound of helicopter rotors approaching. "The evacuation is coming," she said, pulling out her encrypted communication device to signal Stevens that they had successfully reached the extraction point. As they waited for the helicopters, Sarah finally had the conversation with Farid that she had been dreading. They sat together beside the wounded soldiers, speaking quietly, while keeping watch for any signs of insurgent activity. "I need you to understand something," she began. "Everything I did as a doctor was real. Every patient I treated, every life I saved, every moment I spent caring for your people, that was genuine. The deception was about my background, not about my commitment to helping your community." Farid listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful and sad. "I understand why you couldn't tell the truth," he said finally. "In war, everyone has secrets, but it hurts to know that you didn't trust me." "It wasn't about trust," Sarah replied. "It was about protecting you. If you had known who I really was, it would have put you in danger. The insurgents would have seen you as a collaborator with American military forces. And now?" he asked. "What happens now that everyone will know?" Sarah didn't have a good answer for that question. Her 3 years of deep cover work were over, and she would likely be extracted from the region within days. The relationships she had built, the trust she had earned, the medical clinic she had established, all of it would have to be abandoned. The sound of helicopters grew louder, and soon 2 Blackhawks appeared over the horizon. Sarah used her signal mirror to mark their position, and within minutes the aircraft were landing in the courtyard, their rotor wash stirring up clouds of dust and debris. Medical personnel from the helicopters immediately took charge of the wounded soldiers, transferring them to the aircraft with professional efficiency. As they prepared to leave, Sarah realized that this was probably the last time she would see Farid or the village that had been her home for 3 years. "Will you continue the clinic?" she asked him. Farid smiled sadly. "I will try. You taught me much about medicine. Maybe not enough to be a real doctor, but enough to help until someone else comes." As the helicopters prepared to take off, carrying the wounded soldiers to safety, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of boarding the aircraft for extraction, she stepped back from the landing zone. "Commander," shouted the flight medic over the rotor noise, "we're ready to go." Sarah shook her head and pointed to Stevens and his men, who were just emerging from a different section of the village after their fighting withdrawal from the compound. "Take them first," she called back. "I'll wait for the next flight." The helicopter lifted off with its cargo of wounded soldiers and Stevens' team, leaving Sarah and Farid alone in the courtyard. In the sudden quiet after the aircraft departed, they could hear the distant sound of gunfire finally beginning to fade as the insurgent forces realized their targets had escaped. "Why didn't you go?" Farid asked. Sarah looked around at the village that had been her home, thinking about the patients she would never see again, the relationships that had been built on necessary deceptions, and the life she was about to leave behind forever. "Because," she said quietly, "some things are more important than following orders, and saying goodbye properly is one of them." They sat together in the courtyard waiting for the next helicopter and talking about the future. Sarah knew that her career as a SEAL would probably continue, but her time as a village doctor was over. She had been exposed, her cover blown by her own decision to save lives rather than preserve her mission. But as she looked at Farid's face, no longer filled with hurt and confusion, but with understanding and acceptance, she realized that some sacrifices were worth making. The trust of a friend, the knowledge that she had saved lives when it mattered most, and the certainty that she had chosen compassion over duty when the two came into conflict. These things had value that couldn't be measured in mission reports or operational success. When the extraction helicopter finally arrived 20 minutes later, Sarah boarded it with the knowledge that her 3-year mission was complete in ways that had never been planned or anticipated. She had gathered intelligence, built relationships, and served her country. But more importantly, she had remained true to the oath she had taken as a medic, to do no harm, and to help heal the world's wounds wherever she found them. As the helicopter carried her away from the village, Sarah caught one last glimpse of Farid standing in the courtyard, waving goodbye to the woman who had been both Dr. Martinez and Lieutenant Commander Martinez, and who had shown him that sometimes the most important truths are found not in what people say about themselves, but in what they choose to do when everything is on the line.